Let's take a minute and imagine Dodger Stadium not being a stadium at all, but a little town on a hill known as Chavez Ravine. I know it's scary, right? There would be no LA Dodgers today. Today, I will be discussing why Chavez Ravine was wiped out of history, why families fought for their homes and to stay where they were raised and where they grew up. And I will also be discussing the false promises that were made to these residents of Chavez Ravine. Hello, my name is Reina Estrada, and my family was one of the last people to leave Chavez Ravine forcefully on Black Friday. Some of the main points I will be discussing are, first, the history of Chavez Ravine, who lived there, what is it? Second, the public housing, the proposition that was made, and the eminent domain that was taken into action. And third, the evictions and the resistance that many of these residents had towards the end. Let's start with the history of Chavez Ravine. What is Chavez Ravine? Chavez Ravine was an independent Mexican-American community in LA. There were three main neighborhoods. There was Bishop, Palo Verde, and La Loma. This was home to over 19,000 families. And this hill went on for acres. The community was known as a poor, low-income community, also known back then as the slums. Many of the families relied on farming, which was growing crops and cattle to make their income and make ends meet. Now, who lived there? Many people lived there. Many cultures. It was very diverse. There was Mexican-American. Majority of it was Mexican-American. There was Asian. There was Salvadorian. I know there was some Armenian as well. But it was a home to many generations of families. Majority, like as mentioned, were Mexican-American descent. There was grocery stores, churches, schools. There was no shops or liquor stores, I guess you can say. Many of the residents had to walk down the hill into downtown LA to get their milk and bread and stuff other than the grocery store that was there. Many families did not want to leave this area because this is a place where they felt accepted. This is a place where they felt that it was their home. They didn't want to leave somewhere and be discriminated, be racial profiled. Chavez Ravine was a home to everybody. Everybody was accepted. This brings me to eminent domain. So what eminent domain is that it's the right that the government has to confiscate private property for public use with compensation. Meaning, if you lived in a house on Chavez Ravine, the government had its right to force you out of your house, but compensate you as you leave. This action was taken into place because some of the residents didn't want to leave their homes. Some of the residents wanted to stay and build their family for generations to come. The people that did not want to leave were known as squatters. Squatters were known as people that didn't pay their dues, people that didn't want to up and leave for a better future. But what was coming to them was something that they never ever imagined. This leads to the setup of Proposition B. This is basically a vote that was put on the June 3rd, 1958 ballot. Basically, it was if you voted yes on the proposition, you voted yes for the people to come, sheriff and city, to forcefully remove these residents from their homes to start building the housing project. If you voted no, it meant that obviously the people could stay in their homes, build their families, and create a life for themselves. This leads me to my second point, which is public housing. What was the public housing plan? Well, for starters, there was no plan. At least that's what we got from it. During the time that the proposition was being finalized, many people had heard of the American Housing Act of 1949. This had granted funds for the city to build a housing project on the Chavez Ravine property. The mayor at the time, which was Fletcher Brown, he had approved for a building to be built for 10,000 units. And as promised by the mayor, that 3,500 of those units will go to the Chavez Ravine residents that were living there. They were promised first choice of units to live in. The residents of Chavez Ravine were told that they needed to sell their house immediately. So majority of the residents believed it, and they sold their house for little to nothing. Some of them didn't even get the right compensation. This then leads me to the evictions, to my third point. During the evictions, this is where the eminent domain came into play and came into act. The city was able to forcefully, again, remove the residents from their property. They didn't want to, but the ones that stood, and they fought for their land and for their home. By 1953, somehow, some way, whether it was by force or by choice, the police officers and the sheriff's department and the city came and forcefully removed residents from their home. And they were bulldozed minutes later. This is where the false promises come into play. There was absolutely no housing plan whatsoever. It was all a setup for them to leave. And then to conclude, the $56,000 Dodger Stadium was opened, and it opened on April 10, 1962. So today we did discuss what Chavez Ravine was, why the families fought for their land, and the evictions and the resistance. Some of the main points, again, were the history, public housing, and the final eviction. The last thing I will leave you with, there was a little town, a pueblo, if you will, where Dodger Stadium stands today. So next time you see home plate, that is where my grandma's house once stood, my great-grandma's house once stood. We are not squatters. We fought for that land fair and square, and that land was taken from us. It's kind of like we didn't cross the borders crossed us, which was totally unfair. Thanks for listening. Have a good afternoon.